They laughed at her. They said she didn't know what she was doing. But by the time the flood came, nobody on County Road 7 was laughing anymore. Welcome back to Fireside Files, and stay till the end, because what this 20-year-old girl did with one unplowed acre changed everything. The morning Ruby Callaway left a full acre of good bottomland soil unturned. The men leaning on the fence along County Road 7 could not believe what they were seeing. It was mid-March, and the fields all around her family's modest 40-acre spread in the Hatchie River lowlands of western Tennessee were being worked hard. Every tractor in a 5-mile radius was turning earth. The air smelled of diesel and wet clay. Season was short, the window for planting was narrow, and every farmer worth anything knew you didn't waste an inch of workable ground. But there was Ruby, 20 years old, 5'4", hair tucked under a faded cap, steering her father's old John Deere deliberately around a long rectangular stretch of tall, matted grass and sedge that ran along the creek side of the property. She circled it. She left it. And then she kept going as if she had done nothing unusual at all. 3 farmers watched from the road. Dale Huckett, who had worked land in that county for 40 years, took off his cap and scratched his head. "What in the world is that girl doing?" he said. His neighbor Tom Pruitt shook his head slowly. Old Burl Simmons, who farmed the land adjacent to the Callaways, just laughed. A short, dry sound like a door closing on an empty room. "Must not know what she's sitting on," Burl said. "That's some of the richest strip she's got. Her daddy would have had that turned by sunrise." They watched her park the tractor near the barn, climb down without looking their way, and disappear inside. Not hurried, not defiant, just quiet. Nobody said it out loud, but every one of them thought the same thing. The Callaway farm was already struggling. It had been ever since her father's health gave out 2 winters back, and now his only daughter, barely old enough to have a full season under her belt alone, was choosing to leave good ground unplowed at the start of spring. What did she know that they didn't? Or was she simply making a mistake that the rest of the season would prove costly? If you've ever been underestimated because of your age, background, or circumstances, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Fireside Files. Stories like this remind us that wisdom doesn't always come from the loudest voice in the room. What most people in that part of Hardeman County understood, but had long since made peace with, was that the Hatchie River flood plain did what it wanted. Every few years, sometimes every year, the heavy spring rains would push the Hatchie up, past its banks. The water didn't come all at once. It crept. It pooled in the low corners of fields. It channeled through rows of young corn, and left behind a pale, hardened crust of silt that took half a season to work back to something plantable. It wasn't a disaster in the dramatic sense. It was something slower and more grinding, a steady theft. A little less yield each time, a little more debt each winter. The farmers in the lowlands had strategies. They planted on higher ground when they could. They put in drainage tile. Some graded their fields to improve runoff. The water came. You absorbed the loss. You replanted what you could. That was the deal. What nobody had seriously considered, because it was the kind of thing that required thinking about the land in a way most modern farmers didn't have time for, was whether the water's behavior could actually be changed by what you did before the rains arrived. Ruby had been thinking about exactly that, and the acre she had left unturned wasn't a mistake or an oversight. It was a test, based on something she had read in a place most people her age would never think to look. The question the farmers along County Road 7 couldn't have known to ask was this: what happens to floodwater when it meets a wall it wasn't expecting? Ruby Callaway had grown up on that farm the way children grow up in places that are beautiful and difficult at the same time, with a deep familiarity for the land and a quiet understanding that it would demand more than it gave, at least most years. Her father, James Callaway, had worked the ground with patience and a certain old-fashioned thoroughness that had never made him rich, but had kept the farm intact across 3 decades. Her mother had passed when Ruby was 9. After that, it was the two of them, James and Ruby, moving through the seasons together in a routine that had its own unspoken rhythm. When James's heart began giving him trouble in the winter of her 18th year, Ruby had quietly taken over more of the daily work without making a production of it. She didn't announce anything. She just did what needed doing. What she found the winter before the spring in question was a set of her grandfather's notebooks, in a water-stained cardboard box in the back of the equipment shed. Her grandfather, Earl Callaway, had farmed the same land decades earlier and had kept meticulous records, not just of yields and weather, but of observations, sketches of water patterns after storms, notes about which sections of the farm recovered fastest and which stayed wet the longest, diagrams of where the creek bent and what that bend did to the flow during a flood year. And in one notebook from the mid-1960s, a passage that Ruby had read so many times she nearly had it memorized: "The strips I leave rough along the creek, the ones Mama always said were too wet to bother with, those are the ones that slow the water down when it comes. The grass holds, the roots hold, the soil holds, and everything above it holds too." Could a dead man's observations from 60 years ago actually hold the answer to a problem the whole county was still struggling with? Ruby didn't know, but she intended to find out. The strip she had chosen to leave unplowed was not random. She had selected it carefully, tracing the logic of her grandfather's notes against her own observations of the farm over 2 full seasons. The Acre ran parallel to Cane Branch Creek, along the eastern edge of the lowest field, the field that flooded worst, that took the most time to recover, that had been costing Callaway Farm more in lost production than any other single piece of ground. It was approximately 60 feet wide and ran nearly the full length of the field. The soil there was heavy with clay. Native grass and sedge had re-established themselves along the edge in the years when the family hadn't had the machinery or the labor to plow it back. What Ruby was counting on, based on her grandfather's notes and on a handful of soil conservation bulletins she had pulled up on the library computer in Savannah, was the way dense-rooted, undisturbed vegetation behaves when water moves through it. A plowed field is loose and open. Water accelerates across it, picks up particles, carries them away, and moves fast enough to overwhelm drainage and spread damage. But a strip of thick, matted, root-bound native grass acts like a brake. The water slows, the sediment drops, the energy dissipates, and the fields above and below it, the fields with the actual crops, have a chance to drain before the damage is done. It was called a vegetative buffer strip, though Ruby hadn't used that term when she explained it to her father. She just said, "Grandpa Earl left these strips for a reason, and I think I know what it was." Her father had looked at her for a long moment and then nodded. He trusted her. Not everyone did. Now here's where it gets interesting, because Ruby wasn't just guessing. She was watching week after week, waiting for the one storm that would prove her right, or prove her wrong. April came wet, the way April in the Tennessee lowlands usually does. 3 hard rains moved through in the first 2 weeks. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, the kind of spring weather every farmer in the county had navigated 100 times. But Ruby was watching something that nobody else thought to watch. After each rain, she walked the creek edge of her low field before doing anything else. She noted where the water had moved, how far it had crept up the bank, where it had pooled, and each time she saw the same thing. The water had pushed up against the edge of the unplowed strip, lost speed, and spread sideways rather than straight up into the field. The sediment it was carrying, that pale, heavy silt that hardened to concrete when it dried, was dropping out at the boundary of the grass rather than moving across her planted rows. She didn't say anything to anyone. She took notes in the same battered spiral-bound notebook she used for everything else, keeping her observations beside her grandfather's, in the same practical shorthand he had used. Once in early May, Earl Simmons drove past on his tractor while she was walking the strip and called out something that sounded like a joke about weeds. She waved and kept walking. Inside, something was building, not pride exactly, more like the feeling of watching an equation slowly resolve. The numbers were lining up, but it was May, and the real test was still ahead, somewhere in the days she couldn't yet see. The forecast started shifting in the second week of June. A slow-moving low-pressure system had stalled over Arkansas and was pulling moisture up from the Gulf in long, continuous bands. The National Weather Service was issuing statements about multi-day rainfall events. The Hatchie River gauge at Pocahontas was rising. The one at Belvoir downstream was already above flood stage. Farmers in the county watched the radar with the grim, experienced attention of people who had been through this before. They moved equipment to higher ground. They checked their drainage. They called their insurers. A few of them drove their fields one more time, looking at the standing crops and doing the math in their heads. How much rain before the loss becomes serious? How long before the ground simply cannot absorb anymore? The Callaway farm sat in one of the lowest pockets of the basin. Everyone knew it. Ruby had been hearing about it her whole life, from neighbors, from the county extension agent, from the occasional well-meaning stranger who saw the location and shook their head. She spent those days moving through a preparation list she had made in March, when she first saw the seasonal weather outlooks and started thinking seriously about the spring. Equipment elevated, seed stored. The irrigation pump moved to the barn loft. Her father settled in the house, his health too fragile now for the hard work, but his eyes still clear and steady when she came in at the end of each evening. "You ready?" he asked her one night, when the rain was just beginning to tap against the window. "I think so," she said. By Friday morning the sky had gone the color of a cast-iron skillet, and the rain was no longer tapping. It was arriving. It rained for 4 days without stopping. Not a constant heavy downpour, the kind that at least announces itself clearly, but the worst kind, a relentless soaking, patient rain that didn't rush and didn't rest. It moved through the fields like a slow argument, filling every low point, turning every furrow into a channel, and pushing the creek up in long, deliberate surges. By Sunday the branch was out of its banks. By Monday morning the lower third of every field on the east side of County Road 7 was underwater. Dale Huckett lost nearly 30 acres of corn to standing water that wouldn't drain. Tom Pruitt's soybean field, planted in late May, just beginning to push through, took a sheet of silt across it that he wouldn't know the full cost of until July. Earl Simmons, whose land lay just north of the Callaways, watched a section of his creek bank collapse into the current, taking with it a swath of topsoil he'd spent years building. The hatchie crested at 11 feet above flood stage at the county road crossing, the highest it had been in over a decade. People who had been through floods before knew the specific helplessness of those hours. The sound of rain that won't stop, the smell of cold mud, the steady red finger of the gauge moving upward when you want it to hold still. You stand at the edge of what you've built, and you watch the water decide how much of it to take. Ruby stood at the edge of her low field on Monday afternoon in knee-high rubber boots, rain jacket soaked through, and watched the hatchie do what it had come to do. And she watched what happened next. The water that came out of Cane Branch across the lower edge of the Callaway field met the unplowed strip and slowed. Not stopped, the water was too powerful for that, and Ruby had never claimed otherwise. But it slowed, in the way her grandfather's notes had described, the way the conservation bulletins had explained in their dry, technical language. The root mass of the native grass grabbed the silt. The dense packed vegetation absorbed the first surge of kinetic energy. The water spread sideways across the strip rather than charging straight up into the planted rows. And the sediment, the pale, silty load the creek had been carrying down from the upper watershed, dropped out at the boundary and stayed there, piled harmlessly against the edge of the grass rather than smothering the germinating soybeans above it. The planted field directly above the strip drained in hours. The crops that had been above the waterline during the worst of it showed stress, but no death. The silt line, the telltale pale band that would have hardened across the rows, requiring weeks of remediation, stopped at the grass and went no farther. Compared to her neighbors, the difference was stark. Burl Simmons' adjacent field had taken nearly 3 inches of deposited silt across its lower quarter. Tom Pruitt was looking at a replant on 60 acres. Dale Huckett's drainage tile had simply been overwhelmed. The Callaway Farm's low field, the one everyone in the county knew was in the worst possible position, had come through the flood with the least damage of any comparable piece of ground in the basin. The acre she had left unplowed had done exactly what her grandfather's notebook said it would do. 60 years after he'd written it down by lamplight and set it on a shelf for someone to eventually find. Ruby stood in the thinning rain on Tuesday morning and looked at the line where the damage stopped. She didn't feel triumph. She felt something quieter than that, a kind of relief that borders on gratitude, directed at a man she barely remembered, but had been listening to all spring. They came one by one over the next 2 weeks, not in a group, not with fanfare, not with the energy of people coming to apologize. They came the way farmers come when they need to understand something quietly, practically, with boots still muddy from their own fields. Burl Simmons was the first. He came on a Wednesday morning, 4 days after the water had pulled back from his fields, and Ruby saw him from the barn before he reached her. He walked slowly, the way a man walks when he's carrying something heavier than what he's holding. He stopped at the edge of the grass strip and stood there looking at it for a long time, at the clean rows above it, at the silt line that stopped at the boundary and went no farther. When he finally turned to her, the usual dryness was gone from his face. "I need you to tell me what you did here," he said. It wasn't a question, exactly. It was something closer to a man asking to understand why his neighbor's ground held while his own gave way. He'd lost a section of creek bank he'd been building for 15 years. That kind of loss doesn't come out in your voice. It sits in the way you stand. 60 feet, Ruby told him. Grandfather's notes say 40 is the minimum. I went wider to be safe. Burl looked at the strip for a long moment. What kind of grass? Native sedge, switchgrass, some big bluestem that came back on its own. You don't plant it. You just stop plowing it and let it go. Dale Huckett came 2 days later, and Tom Pruitt the day after that. The county extension agent came out on a Thursday and walked the strip with a measuring tape and a notebook. Asking questions Ruby answered without impatience or condescension. She showed them her grandfather's journals. She printed out the conservation bulletins she had cross-referenced against his observations. Nobody laughed. Nobody had anything left to laugh about. They stood in the field, serious and attentive, and they listened to a 20-year-old woman explain something that had been sitting in an equipment shed for decades, waiting for someone to read it. Her father was on the porch the afternoon the extension agent left, wrapped in a blanket despite the June warmth, watching the county road the way he had watched it for 40 years. Ruby sat beside him and told him how the conversations had gone. He listened without interrupting, the way he always had. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your grandfather would have liked you." It was not a complicated thing to say, but it was the right thing, and it landed in her chest the way right things do. Earl Callaway had farmed that ground in a time before synthetic inputs made the soil seem infinitely forgiving, before tile drainage made it easy to ignore what water did when it moved across a field. He had watched and recorded and thought carefully about things that most people in his era were also too busy to think carefully about. And then life had moved on and taken his observations with it, folded into a cardboard box in a shed, undisturbed for 60 years, until his granddaughter opened the box. The following spring, 3 farms along County Road, 7 established vegetative buffer strips along their creek edges. The county extension office ran a workshop about riparian buffers that drew farmers from 4 counties. 2 years after the flood, aerial photographs of the Hatchie Basin showed more than 1,000 linear feet of new native grass strip where plowed ground had been. None of it would have happened if a 20-year-old woman had not been dismissed as too young to know anything, and had not responded to that dismissal not with argument or anger, but with a season of quiet, careful work guided by the handwriting of a man most of them had never met. The land remembers things if you give it room to. The people who work it can learn to remember too, but usually only after the water has risen once and the damage has been counted, and someone patient enough to have been paying attention all along shows them where the line held. Ruby Callaway didn't set out to prove anyone wrong. She set out to protect a farm. In the end, she protected a lot more than that. If this story moved you, don't scroll past without hitting subscribe, because Fireside Files brings you a new one just like it every week.